where I was sitting in the theater watching the play. The subject was roses, and just a wonderful play with Jack Albertson and Martin Sheen. Martin Sheen played the son. And I mean, it was this play, it was a father son play. And I have father son issues, which explains to you why I was a business major. And I sat there in the theater watching this play with tears rolling down my face. And I said, I can't spend the rest of my life in the audience. And I went back to school. I changed my major from business to theater. I did not tell my parents, who did not find out until Christmas when my grades arrived. And my father was looking at my grades and he said, "What is directing 101?"
That was the voice of Oscar and Emmy-winning director, producer, and acting teacher Milton Justice. And it is my absolute delight to have him on as the guest of this episode of the Page and Stage podcast, where we explore the art and craft of writing and performance. As always, I'm your host, Jason Cannon, and this week we dig deep into the challenges of teaching acting. And Milton and I talk about taking class with Stella Adler, teaching class with a translator in Korea, and the traps of accepted actor vocabulary. But before we get to all that, a brief Page and Stage plug. This podcast is only one part of my story coaching work. You can check out everything I'm up to over at pageandstage.art, including my other podcast, 100 Plays, as well as my weekly newsletter, full of tips, tricks, inspiration, and encouragement for storytellers of all stripes. Again, that's pageandstage.art. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about my awesome guest, Milton Justice. And this is one of those cool, it's who you know kind of things. It's a reminder that the creative world can often be very small. But you'll remember in season 1, I interviewed the incredible playwright Jeffrey Couchman. And his agent was so happy with his podcast that she introduced me to Albert Poland, who you met this season. And Albert had so much fun that he introduced me to his friend Milton Justice, our guest today. So it's a wonderful kind of dominoes falling over of getting to meet this man. And I'll tell you what, Milton has probably forgotten more about acting than most of us will ever learn. The man he has worked with legends. I mentioned before Stella Adler. He's worked with Mark Ruffalo. He has lived the life of the theater artist and taken in so much knowledge about how theater works, about how storytelling works, about how the actor's brain works. And when I first met him, he sent me a copy of his book, I Don't Need an Acting Class, great title, which is also the title of his podcast, which I immediately did a deep dive into, and it's just him teaching acting to his acting students. And it's fascinating, and you learn so much, and I feel so lucky that he's come on this show and is going to share some of that knowledge with us, along with a lot of fascinating and hilarious stories about his interactions with other stars of stage and screen and how he sort of stumbled his way into a career that he wouldn't trade for anything else. If you want to read his full bio, I'm going to put that right in the show notes. But let's get to it. Here we go with my conversation with Milton Justice. All right, I'm connected with the one and only Milton Justice. This is really exciting.
Thank you. It's great to talk to the one and only Jason Cannon.
You know, I have Googled that name, Milton, when I was looking for domain names for like jasoncannon.com, and there are a few other Jason Cannons out there. One of them does computer programming, one of them is a photographer, and they'd already taken my domain.
Damn. Well, I looked up Milton Justice once, and I found out, I think he's in prison for murder or something, and, you know, somebody sent me a very cryptic email saying, "How dare you?"
I don't know. That could be an interesting follow-up to this one, Milton. Go talk to the one in prison. Do you belong here?
Maybe.
All right. So, Milton, we met through your friend, Albert Poland, who I had on my show a few weeks ago. Another just amazing, amazing artist. How do you and Albert know each other?
So, in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, My best friend from college, Jack Hefner, who wrote the play Vanities, which became the longest running play in off Broadway history, eventually it was overtaken by Vampire Lesbians of Sodom. But at the time, yeah, I know.
If you have to lose to somebody, right?
I know. So somebody had to do it. And so I had like Jack and I had Garland Wright directing. Garland would eventually become the artistic director of the Guthrie. Kathy Bates was in it. And so I walked into Albert's office and I said, I took a class at the New School. And the guy said I needed a general manager. And I asked him for a suggestion. And so he said, here's Albert Pullen. And of course, I knew nothing. I mean, it was like so brilliant. It was just like you were blindly saying, oh, yes, I'll produce an off Broadway play. So I walked into Albert and I said, I have Kathy Bates and this and that and this and that. And he looked at me and he said, who are you?
Great intro. Oh my gosh.
So, I mean, we were friends ever since. And actually, Albert was so patient because I was a total and complete idealist. I just thought, well, you want to put on a play? So you put on a play. I was right out of the Mickey Judy School of Theater. And so Albert really walked me through everything. You have to do this, and you have to do this, and you actually have to raise money. And so
What? Well, speaking of Mickey and Judy, sorry, I was just going to say, so Milton, this is probably pretty close, but I always like to jump in with someone on their origin story, right? I mean, you teach actors. Every
Right.
actor has that moment where the penny dropped, where they saw the performance or had the experience and made them go, I have to be an actor. Now, I think that's true for almost every artist.
I
There's a
agree.
moment where that clarity hits you and there's nothing else you're going to do. What is Milton Justice's kind of origin story when it comes to being in theater and storytelling?
Well, I in high school in Texas, and so I was weird, and didn't fit in, and everybody played football, or So I mean, if you could see a full view, you would say that's not going to happen. And so the only thing you could do was to be in the theater. And so, at any rate, I was in plays. But it was interesting. It was just total blind instinct, no idea what I was doing. And I mean, this is back in the mid 60s in Dallas, where we were doing a 40-minute cutting of Waiting for Godot for a high school play. I mean, many people have talked about my performance as Estragon in the 40-minute at the age of 16.
You had the life experience, you were ready.
I was ready for that. So when I went off to college, I did what my father wanted me to do. I went to business school, and then I went to business school with the idea of pre-law, and I was in a dorm with a guy named Garland Wright. And so we were put on the decoration committee for the dorm open house or some damn thing. And so he walked into the meeting and I was quoting a line, unbelievably, from the Fantastics. And he said, which had only opened like a year before.
Right.
And so he said, oh, that's from the Fantastics. I mean, and so I said, oh, we should do it sometime. And so, unbelievably, we got the rights to do it in the student union the next year. And I mean, you could see it was all, you just blindly leapt in. Oh, let's do the Fantastic. Oh, you have to have the rights. Anyway, so Garland and I went to New York for 2 weeks that summer and saw, I think in 2 weeks, we saw 14 plays. I mean, we went to every matinee, we went to every evening performance. It was, and I mean, I throw this out because it's so absurd now. It's like we had fourth row center tickets to a matinee to see Barbara Streisand in Funny Girl, and the tickets were $9.95.
What?
I know. In fact, I have a whole wall full of playbills, and that's one of them. So, but there was another Wednesday matinee where I was sitting in the theater watching the play. The subject was roses. And just a wonderful play, a three-character play with Jack Albertson and West Wing. Who played the president?
Oh, right. Sheen, Martin Sheen.
Martin Sheen. Martin Sheen played the son. And I mean, it was this play, it was a father-son play. And I have father-son issues, which explains to you why I was a business major. And I sat there in the theater watching this play with tears rolling down my face. And I said, I can't spend the rest of my life in the audience. And I went back to school. I changed my major from business to theater. I did not tell my parents, who did not find out until Christmas when my grades arrived. And my father was looking at my grades and he said, "What is directing 101?" Totally found out. Anyway.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Quick pause, because I'm sure my more sharp-eyed viewers on YouTube have already picked up on this if they haven't already read your bio. But just over your shoulder there's an Emmy and there's an Oscar glowing in the New York sunlight. And I'm sure everyone wants to know how the heck those ended up on your bookshelf there.
Well, I really seriously, you asked some interesting questions like, what was there a motto? Was there something that was kind of like part of my life? And I just kept bumping into things. I was the only theater major who could play the piano. I was the only theater major who knew how to sing. And so I became the go-to theater major anytime there was music in a play. And so we did a world premiere that had music in it. And so I had to do the music. And so the composer came down and liked what I'd done with his music. And this is going someplace, I promise. So he liked what I had done with his music and asked me if I wanted to be his assistant that summer. So we're now the summer of 1968. And I said, yeah, sure. And so, I was graduating and it was like, and so now where do you live? And he said, New York. And I went, oh my God, because I had already, this first time I came to New York, it's like I knew that's where I belonged. I certainly didn't belong in Dallas, Texas. And I just suddenly was there and it was magical. So he turned out he was the resident composer at the New York Shakespeare Festival. And so I literally graduated from SMU on Sunday, went to work at the New York Shakespeare Festival on Friday.
Wow.
And the director was somebody named Jerry Friedman. And so Jerry would one day become the head of Juilliard, but he was a director. Well, I was dying to be his assistant. So time goes by, and I ended up in England for a while. Then I ended up working for Bob Hope for 5 years.
Right, you went to Vietnam like 4 times with USO, yeah.
Yeah, so I kept saying yes. I'd never worked in television. My first boss said to me, never say no to anything that might be a new opportunity for you. And it was brilliant. That was the summer of 1964. I have never forgotten it, and I've never said no. And so they asked me, do you want to come? And again, it was like Bob Hope had donated $1 million to SMU to build the Bob Hope Theater. And so they needed me to do music for the Royal Hunt of the Sun. And I happened to be there, and it was a week before I went to rehearsal. And they said, listen, they need somebody to help them. Would you be willing to work before you go into rehearsal? And so, first of all, I have to say, they were paying me $15 an hour. This is like 1969. I don't even imagine how much money that was. And so they asked me to organize the carpool. And I said, fine. And Chrysler had given them 9 Chrysler Imperials. And would I hire my friends to pick up the stars at the Hilton across the street and bring them to rehearsal? So I had this little list. When did John Davidson need to be there? When did Michelle Lee need to be there? When did Janice Page need to be there?
Wow.
So I had this list. And so they looked at me one day and they said, "Did somebody tell you to make that list?" And I said, "No." I mean, it made sense. And they looked at me and they said, "So you came up with the idea of having this list that's," and I said, "Yes." And so they said, "Well, when you finish here, why don't you come out to Hollywood and we'll put you to work?" And so the first part of my career is based on the fact that I knew how to make a list. And apparently I am the only one of my friends that knows how to make a list.
You are overqualified, Milton.
I know. I made a list. I put, Gary Roberts, pick up Janice Page, 11 o'clock. And I mean, it was just like, how difficult was that? Okay, so then so I go out. They must have been really surprised to see me because I arrived at the Bob Hope Show producer's office and said, "Hi, you said come out, you'd put me to work." And they went, so I went, okay. So my job was a brilliant job. That meant that I knew how to drive. And so there were 12 writers. And so I'd pick up the material from the producer's office, drop it off with the writers. Now, you have to understand, this is before even fax, forget email.
Right.
And I'd take the material and they'd write it. And then they'd call me and say, "I've finished it." And so then I'd bring it back to the office and the producer, Mort, would put it together. So then one day Mort says, he's sitting in the office and he's just furious. And he said, "I've got to get some in here who knows how to type." And so I looked at him. Unbelievably, I knew how to type. And I mean, this is 1969. Men didn't know how to type. I'd learned how to type because I had measles one summer and found my mother's Greg typing book, and I was trying to find something to do. So he said to me, "Are you fast?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm really fast." And so he said, "Here's a script. Let me see." And so I started typing. I got about halfway through the second sentence, and he said, "You've been promoted. You're now our production secretary. Get your shot. You're going to Vietnam for Christmas." And so a job seriously that was about 2 weeks lasted 5 years. And so this gets back to how I ended up eventually with the Oscars. So there was a point, it was bizarre. It was the mid 70s. And I was thinking, is this how I'm spending my life? Rewriting lyrics to Thanks for the Memory? I mean, it was just weird. And I got to meet the most amazing people. I mean, seriously, the most amazing people. I mean, it's like sitting in Bing Crosby's dressing room and taking notes from him on his participation in the war, because Bob was writing a book called The Last Christmas Show, and it was all about the war years. And then, I met Jack Benny, and I sat with Jack Benny writing down. I mean, it was just like one person after another, and I kept thinking, I'm a kid from Texas. What the hell am I doing in Jack Benny's hotel room, taking down notes for a sketch he wants to do? And so, I mean, it was just brilliant. I mean, I got drunk with Martha Ray. And, I mean, it was like you kept sitting there and thinking, how did this happen? But I was getting tired of the Bob Hope Show. And I was in New York, walking down 46th Street, and ran into Jerry Friedman, who had been the director at the New York Shakespeare Festival that I was dying to work for. And he said, we hadn't seen each other in a long time. We'd sort of kept in touch. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, I'm directing the opening production of a play in Los Angeles. And I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, we're opening a theater." And I said, "You must need an assistant." And he said, "It pays $25 a week." And I looked at him and I said, "Jerry, I've been working in television. I can afford to work for $25 a week." So the play was Little Foxes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the play starred Lee Grant, Barbara Barry, Carol O'Connor,
Whoa.
Bruce Davison, Burgess Meredith, and dear, dear, dear Harris Yulin, who, of course, passed away a couple of days ago. And this was the production I walked into. And Jerry left after opening night. He had another gig and left the play with me. And
Wow.
I mean, you talk about constantly being in over your head. And these were people that wanted notes. I mean, it wasn't like, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. And Lee Grant, this is so funny. So Lee Grant had years before, she'd just gotten off the blacklist, and she was working as Anne Bancroft's understudy in a play called Prisoner of Second Avenue. And so they said if she would do the London production, that she could understudy the New York production during rehearsals. And that was kind of a deal she made. And and Bancroft got sick one night. Lee had only had 2 rehearsals, and so she went on, and she said seriously, it was pieces of the script were all over the place. As a result, she was petrified about like not knowing the play and not knowing the lines. And
Actor's nightmare. Yep.
And I went in every single night during the 7 weeks run of Little Foxes and rehearsed the play with her. I mean, I didn't cue her. She acted the play. And I played all the other parts, which was an amazing education for me.
Yeah.
And so at the end of that, she said, my husband and I have a film company. Why don't you come work for us? And eventually Lee directed Down and Out in America, which her husband and I produced, which won the Oscar. And it was just like, I mean, it's
So
so
basically, you just run into furniture is what you're saying.
totally. It's like my whole life is just like I happened to run into it's the same. Weirdly enough, it was the same way I met Stella Adler. So now I was really unhappy in California. And so my college girlfriend said to me, you should audition for Stella Adler's class. She's giving a master class out here. I took the class last summer, and it was fantastic. And so I said, all right. So by now, I belonged to a tennis club. I mean, I really was living the Hollywood life. And so there was a wonderful woman there, and I said to her, why don't we audition for Stella Adler's class? And we did a scene from the play. The subject was roses, that had been such an important part of my life. And so we auditioned for Stella's class and got in. And it was a miracle. Quite honestly, it was like, oh my God. And at one point, Stella said, she said, if it's the business you want, you're in the right place. But if it's an art form you're looking for, you must come east. And then it hit me. I thought, oh, I know what my problem is. I've been in the business now. I've been in the business for almost 10 years. And so I said, that must be what I need, an art form. And so then like the newly converted, I just upped. I was working as a PA at Universal Studios on a movie called Airport 77, which was reason enough to, although Olivia de Havilland was in it and I could spend time with Olivia, but nonetheless, and I went, and unbelievably, my friend Tommy Hulse, who was in this is years before Mozart and Amadeus, was in the national tour of Equus, and he wanted to stay in California, and I wanted to go to New York, so we switched apartments. I mean, it was just, and so I moved to New York. But it was just, I don't know, it's so weird to me. All of it.
Well, I think this is actually an important point to put out there for anyone listening who's kind of aspiring in any way, is that, and I love what you said too, if it's a new opportunity, say yes, because like you just said, I get this question a lot from young actors or acting apprentices, like, Should I take this job or this job? Or what's the next thing I should do? Or would this hurt my career? You know, it's like a lot of there's no answer to that. You honestly,
It's none.
you can call it luck, you can call it fate. I mean, whatever you need to call it for your belief system. But there is such happenstance. There is such, like, I do the same thing, Milton. When I look back, I can trace every single job I've ever had back to Donna Northcott at St. Louis Shakespeare giving me a shot on Comedy of Errors. You know what I mean? It's just because you meet the person, the thing, and then that person does this, and then this and this. You got measles and learned to type, and I mean, it's just you never know what's going to be the leverage point.
Yeah, I will say to add to that though, because I get all my philosophies of life from Stephen Sondheim, and and I loved opportunity is not a lengthy visitor. Here's the thing that I have, it's so weird, as arbitrary as all of it is, I actually believe that everyone has an opportunity. And I really believe that if you are prepared, it will happen. And that's the reason it's like, I get nuts when people worry about the business instead of learning the craft. And it's just like, if you will learn to act and really know how to act, it will be there. The opportunity will be there. And then, to quote Mr. Sondheim, opportunity is not a lengthy visitor. I have often said, and by the way, you better be ready because it's not coming back.
Right.
And that's the other thing, I think. I think it's the same thing. They took a chance on you in Comedy of Errors, but you'd done the work. It wasn't like you blindly fell into it.
Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, my entire life has been kind of like they took a chance, but I'd done a lot of work in order to get there. And along the way, oh God. So I moved to New York to study with Stella. But in the meantime, I'd made a lot of money off working in television and decided I wanted to do a documentary. And did a documentary on a dancer. Back then, there was the Harkness Ballet Company, and I had some connections, and I filmed it. Nobody ever bought this documentary. I have so many projects like that. I thought, of course, everybody's interested in why people create. And this is back before Bravo, Arts and Entertainment. Nobody cared about why people create. So, but at any rate, there was a film company that was interested in the dancer that I had because they were thinking of using him in a film. And so I showed them the film. And they asked me if I wanted to come and work for them. And so, And so I said, sure. Something I've never worked in a film company. And so I ended up going to work for this film company. In fact, oddly enough, somebody from The Observer is doing an article on Star Wars, the first Star Wars, and they asked for people who had seen the original film. And so oddly enough, we were doing a film and Carrie Fisher auditioned. And this is before Star Wars came out. And of course, she was just this fabulously funky actress.
Yeah.
And I happened to know her mother, Debbie Reynolds, briefly because of Bob Hope, and she'd done a TV special with us. Anyway, the film company, one day I walk in and they said, read this play. And I read this play that happened to be by Tennessee Williams. And I said, why am I reading this play? And they said, we're thinking of producing it. And I went, okay. So I later would think to myself, Tennessee was really desperate to get plays produced if he came to this film company. It's because nobody wanted to produce this play. Anyway, so there were auditions. And so one day the producers said, Milton, would you go down to the Hotel Elise and pick up Tennessee Williams and bring him back up to the office? And so I was riding up Park Avenue in a taxi with Tennessee Williams going up to our office. And I mean, that was just like, None of it. I mean, God, I don't know. Maybe there are people who can plan their careers and say, I'm
Yeah.
going to do this because I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this, and then it'll lead to that. And I think a lot of people are tricked into believing that there's a way to do it. I mean, one of the
Right. That
things
there's
that
one right path. Yeah. Yeah.
yes, and I mean, even the word networking. It's just like, I'm going to a party. There are going to be people from the business there. I have a student now who I've taken charge of his career because he's really talented and drop dead gorgeous. And he came back and he said, "Yeah, I went to a party yesterday, and this woman came up to me. She'd like my stuff because she'd like to send it to an agent friend." And I said, "Madior, she wants to go to bed with you. Leave it. There is no shortcut. I
Right.
mean,
Right.
yes, just go back to working on this monologue."
Yeah.
But it's, and it's just like, but I think it is one of the problems of the time we're living in. It's like, it seems that there are shortcuts.
Yeah, yeah, that
And
going viral has like changed the whole concept of what it means to pay your dues, how you actually build a career, how you leave yourself open to opportunity.
yeah,
This is great, Milton. You
yeah.
just mentioned one of your students. I definitely want to talk about this because you have both a book and a podcast called "I Don't Need an Acting Class," which is such a great like what kind of title. I love it. So
I,
you just a minute ago too talked about the importance of being prepared, that honing the craft, so that when opportunity does come for that split second, you're able to pounce on it. So how did you then get into teaching, and where is this idea of I don't need an acting class? Why is that the Milton Justice hook, both for your book and your
I,
podcast?
okay. Well, so first of all, I didn't know I could teach. I took classes with Stella Adler for 5 years. I could not leave class. And she and I became friends as much as anybody becomes friends. I mean, it was weird. Suddenly I'm producing a Tennessee Williams play and I invite Stella to the opening. And it's like, oh, we both know Tennessee. I mean, it was just weird. And so, but I kept going to class and I kept going to class and I kept going to class. And then I won an Oscar. In fact, I have a telegram on my wall that she sent me after the Oscar, and then I won an Emmy for an after-school special and children's special. And so by this time, my dear friend, who I've known since he was in the mailroom at the William Morris Agency, is now one of the owners of CAA. And so he called me and he said, "If not now, when?" And I thought, yeah, you're right. Now, in the midst of all of this, I had oddly enough started coaching actors based on what I knew in class. I didn't even know I could teach. But it's like I coached Kira Sedgwick, who was in an after school special I produced all constantly, and then Grant Show, who was in an after-school special and so I was coaching these people, and it somehow or another I was able to translate what I'd learned from Stella into something for other actors to use, and I didn't even know it. I mean, I honestly didn't realize I had a knack for teaching, and so I coached Grant for the play version of On the Waterfront, which he got. And so he and I moved to Los Angeles at the same time, and we worked every day before he left for rehearsals. And very boldly one day, I decided, let's take the scene into Stella's class. She was teaching a master class. And I thought, he's doing a really good job. There was another older actor from class that I knew personally well. And so I worked with the two of them on I believe it or not, it didn't take place in the back of a taxi, but I could have been a contender. And we brought it in for Stella. I mean, people were like, nobody dares bring in Streetcar for Stella, much less.
Right.
And Stella loved it. And you knew she did because she invited both Grant and me over for dinner after class that night. And so she said to me, "What are you planning to do while you're waiting for your producing career to take off?" And I said, "I have no idea." And she said, "I want you to teach for me." And I was like, "What?" And she knew I'd worked with Grant. And it was like, "I want you to teach for me." And Stella was very commanding. It wasn't like a discussion. And so then eventually she said, "I think we should have a theater company. I want you to be artistic director of the theater company." I said, "Okay." But what I really found was that I looked back at my old notes from Stella from when I first studied with her, and I realized that I took notes like somebody who was going to teach. And so interesting because most actors take notes specifically about how it's going to help their acting. And my notes were about concepts that would be usable for an actor. And so and I did go back and forth for forever. I mean, I was still producing things and I was still developing things, but it was really what I liked doing. And then eventually I had the great luxury doing a film which Kira was in, and her husband Kevin Bacon was directing it. I was producing it. Helen Mirren starred in it. And it was like, you got to do this perfect movie. It went to Sundance. It was nominated for 3 Golden Globes. Helen won. And I thought, this is as good a time as any to move into teaching. So then, it was just weird things. I was teaching in Korea, another thing where I didn't say no because it was so weird. Anyways, I was teaching at Yale because somebody who had heard students complain about me when I was teaching at Stella Adler in New York, and she said they'd come into my class complaining about you. And she said, and I asked them what had they done, and she said, and it sounded like Stella. What you were demanding of them was, she said, it was just vintage Stella. You're making cliched choices. You're not really thinking on this. You're winging it as if and so at any rate, so she suggested me to Yale, and so I went to teach at Yale. And while I was at Yale, somebody from Korea got in touch with me to see if I wanted to teach in Korea. And I said, I don't speak Korean. And they said, we'll get you an interpreter. And so there was this whole thing about that. And I thought, and a writer friend of mine, Deb Margolin, who was at Yale, said, "Milton, you can always teach at Yale. What you can't always do is teach in a foreign country." And so I said, okay. And I had this adorable, fabulous, brilliant translator.
Okay.
And
great. Can I pause right there, Milton? Because I wanted to ask about this. So it's a 2-part question. So one, because this is exactly something I was going to ask about. How do you teach to actors who don't even speak your language, who exist in a completely different culture? So part one of my part one question is, I'm curious because you said something to the effect of that you were able to translate things you learned from Stella into things that can be useful to actors. I'm curious in terms of the Milton Justice system of acting, what are 1 or 2 of the key tenets of what you give to actors? And then the part 2 question is, how do you give those to actors from different cultures, different artistic understandings, different linguistic backgrounds? So what are the key things that you teach, and how in the world do you teach that to other people in other countries?
I kind of have to answer it in reverse. And
okay.
The reason is, but here's what happened. I got used to hearing Paul I'd say something in English and I'd hear it in Korean. So I got used to coordinating that. One day, Paul looked at me and said, "They don't have that word in Korean." And I went, wow. And so suddenly I was having to translate what I considered to be a well-known vocabulary of acting into common vocabulary.
You had to get to a base. Okay, okay.
And man, I learned so much. I learned so much. And what I realized was the vocabulary of acting is strangling actors. What
Wow.
I
Okay.
realized was that an actor is saying, "What's my action?" And they freak out. I mean, hell, even I have the book Actions Thesaurus
I have that
because
book.
yes. And it's because actors say, "Oh my God, what's my action? What's my action?" And I thought they didn't have that word in Korean. In fact, I realized every time you ask an actor what their action is, it's like you can see, it's like a deer in headlights, they freeze. And so I ended up, in a sense, not changing the vocabulary, but making the vocabulary of acting more accessible. And what I realized was that reading, a close friend of mine is a teacher named Sharon Carnegie, and she's written all sorts of books, including Stanislavski and Focus. And an article I read about from her that she wrote that she said Stanislavski never wanted a vocabulary, that his work came out of common everyday usage. And so what I found out was, and this came, I was directing a production of Waiting for Lefty in Korea, and Paul, my translator, was playing Joe. And man, he did every exercise. He was absolutely brilliant. I had him build a past of his day, and he came up with the most fabulous things of driving the taxi and seeing a family in the window of a diner and living through the fact he couldn't afford food for his family. I mean, all of this stuff that he had it. And the first line of the play is he walks in and all the furniture has been repossessed. And his line is, "Where's all the furniture, honey?" Could not get it. Could not get it. I gave him actions. I mean, I gave him actions. And then at one point I looked at him and I said, "Paul, what's going on with this guy?" And he said, "I can't make life work." And I said, "Now do the scene." And what I realized was there are better questions than what's your action. There are better questions because the questions may be, what's going on with this dude? And that if you can own experientially what's going on with him, then the scene comes out of that. And that was mind-boggling for me. It was mind-boggling for me. And then eventually I replaced the word action constantly. I'll say to an actor, "So what's the impulse here? What, and it's like, why? Why are you going out on this? Why are you going out into that room?" And he said, and if the actor looks at me, he says, "Because this is bull." And I said, "Good, that's the impulse." But you know what I mean? It's like, so how did I change things? I think I understood all of this stuff, which I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly learning by directing a play I'm directing now. I'm readapting the Strindberg play, The Stronger, written for two middle-aged actresses in the late 1800s. And so we're adapting it for two gay men in contemporary. But the thing that I'm finding is that working this way and making actors improvise stuff that's like, all right, so yesterday I worked on an exercise with them and I said, "So what do you think about Simon's acting?" And so building that relationship leads him to make it clear how he's living off his partner. So it's like, I don't know, the more that I've taught them and the more that I've worked with actors and I keep learning and I'm old and I keep learning, the more that I figure out just how phenomenally creative acting is.
I was going to say, Milton, that whole thing about what is the impulse or why are you going in that room? Like my actor brain, I translate it as that's a simpler way to ask what's your motivation. Just like action is one of those buzzwords,
Yeah,
motivation is one of those actor buzzwords. But saying what's the impulse? Yeah, that's an easier way in.
Yes, and I even think saying things like, so what's going on with this dude? And having an actor talk out the experience of what's going on with me at this moment is like also a road in. Yes, I found that I had to change the vocabulary for the for the actor in the 21st century, because all those motivation was the perfect one. Is another one of those words that just like freezes you because action to me is the worst. Oh,
It immediately puts you into your head, into analytical mode, as to being open or vulnerable or emotional. Yeah.
And that's one of our biggest.
Like it's good for pre-work or analysis, but yeah.
No, and actors are always complaining about that. I'm too much in my head, or somebody says you're too much in your head, and so the question is, well, yes. I also have people talk out everything. I mean, I find writing out work is not good for actors because writing is a different muscle than acting, and so it may help you get specific. That's one thing, but it's a totally different thing. I mean, to me, if actors write out too much, they might as well hand out their notebook to the audience and say, this is what I was trying to do. Same thing about thinking out. I know. But the other thing is, it's just like thinking my work. It's like, God, if you could hear me sing in my head, it's like you'd be blown away. And and so I have people talk out. Yesterday, I had him talk out what he thought about the other actor's work when he first saw him. And it's like one thing to think it out, one thing to analyze it, one thing to get intellectual about it, but it's another thing to talk it out. And so one of the things that I find has been most useful, that for some reason people, I don't know, seem to be shocked by it, is talking out. People always say, oh yes, Milton has a talking out method. And I think the talking out method, doesn't everybody do that? But it's something that's become more specific to me because actors tend to have a tendency to, and I've heard it constantly. Yes, the play takes place during the Depression in America. There was a taxi strike, and you can hear this boring grocery list, none of which is helping actors. And so I stop actors from reporting right away. It takes a lot. I drive people insane. But it's like, and it's funny. I met Ellen Barkin once, and so she said, what are you working on in class? And I said, well, this term, I'm really focusing a lot on experiencing everything that you talk about as an actor. And she said, like what? And so I said, well, like if I said that the play took place in New York in the winter, and she was sitting across a table from me, and she just sort of like mimed putting a thing, and I thought, my God, that's all it takes for her. New York winter, and suddenly she has winter. And most of the time, I find that actors just are doing a book report. It takes place in the winter in New York, and so it's like this analytical tone that they take as an actor. And that's one of the things I think that I've really worked to make actors more actively involved in the play and what's going on in the play by doing that.
I'm going to ask you a question now about teaching on Zoom. So you did all this work, you taught in foreign countries. I'm guessing a lot of this coalesced into your book and now your podcast. But I've been listening to your podcast, and it's basically capturing you teaching acting on Zoom to your various students. So I'm curious, as you've had to translate teaching acting to other countries, how have you translated your acting teaching onto Zoom, and how did that podcast even come together?
Oh, God, that was the scariest thing. Well, I had an actor that I worked with when I taught at NYU. He did a one-man show, which he had written. And I'm a terrible writer. I have to say, Jason, really not a good writer at all. But I have really good instincts. I have very good structural instincts. And in fact, for years, when I was working in film with Lee Grant, I was developing scripts, and writers liked to work with me because I knew I couldn't write, but I'd write little notes. You need a line like, and it would always amuse them. Anyway, but I helped Walker with his one-man show, and he was over at my house one day and saw a draft of my book, and he was reading through it, and he said, "Oh my God, this is a podcast." And I said, "What is a podcast?" And so, at any rate, I said, "A podcast about acting?" And then it was weird. I had a student, Chris Carmack, who's now on Grey's Anatomy, and he said, "You know, there are no acting podcasts." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, I mean, you get actors talking about getting a career, but nothing talking about acting." And I went, so anyway, Walker said, "I'll come over and, I have a microphone now, and sound set up." I have no idea how any of this was put together. Anyway, and so the first 6-8 episodes were just kind of like paraphrasing chapters of my book. And then the pandemic hit. And then I was teaching over Zoom. And so Walker decided it was a good idea to record my class, and he would edit it down. I mean, the man's a saint. And so, because my class is like 2.5 hours, and he pulls it down to like 15, 16, 17 minutes. Which means he is really cutting out a lot. I know. No, he cuts out a lot of my book, but he really liked doing it. I mean, and we have over 200 episodes. I mean, he's a genius. But he's also, I have to say, he's a little bit, he said, periodically he stops into class and he'll say things like, "That's not really clear. Could you say that again another way?" But oddly enough, the book first came about because my translator would go home at night after class or after rehearsal and write me an email, making sure that he got the concept clear. And then I would get up in the morning and write an email back to him, which I really had to think out because I was teaching and I wanted to make sure he was clear what it was. So collecting all of them, it then became a thing. I just was, I would comment to actors. Actors knew they could email me with problems and I would answer them. So all of that was kind of an interesting just evolution. Teaching over Zoom, however, was very interesting. What I've liked about it is now all auditions are self-tapes.
Yep.
Teaching over Zoom meant I was in a constant close-up of an actor. And I could really tell if it wasn't landing. And that I really liked about it. Recently, I've been directing a play and also, well, as you know, I was teaching in Berlin and Bucharest and Stockholm, and being with live actors again was really fabulous. And in fact, I'm going to start live classes in September. I said, "Oh, human beings. This is so interesting." But I have to say, teaching over Zoom, because of the podcast we would hear from people, and teaching over Zoom has really allowed me to, and it's still a small class, but it's like, God, I have a student from Ukraine who's 18, whose parents sent him to Poland after the invasion. And so I have him. And then I have a wonderful woman from Berlin. I have students from New Mexico. I have students from California, a guy from Canada. But you know what I mean? It's like, and so suddenly it becomes this weird kind of AA meeting on Saturday afternoons where a group of actors from all over the place get together with like-minded people and we work on acting concepts.
Wow.
So that part of it I really like.
That's amazing. Great, Milton. I might have to call you and schedule a follow up just so we can actually go deep into the acting stuff. But I do need to turn to the spotlight now, just to be cognizant of your time and the length of our recording here. So I'm going to ask you a couple.
Wow.
Yeah, time flies, right?
God.
All right. Question one is if you could ask any one person any one question, who would that person be and what would you ask?
Oh, God. I don't know. I'd probably ask Stanislavski, what were you thinking? I mean, God Almighty. And the cover of my book, I have this kind of drawing of Stella, and Stella said, and I knew the first things that Stella ever said to Stanislavski, which was, "You've made me hate acting." And so I told it to the publisher, and they liked that. And so then they said, "What do you think Stanislavski said?" So I called my friend Sharon Carnegie. And I said to her, I told her the story, and she said, "Well, I don't know what Stanislavski said to Stella, but I'll tell you what he said to Josh Logan, who was a big director in the 30s and 40s. And she said, Josh Logan said to Stanislavski, 'Your way of working is very confusing to me,' to which Stanislavski answered, 'Oh, you must have read my books.'" And I thought, yes, my God, what were you thinking? Anyway, I think I really would like to know the secret of acting. So if I could ask anybody, I think I would really like to have a conversation with Stanislavski about this.
That's great.
I'm thinking.
Next question. What is the best advice that you have ever taken?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, and I think never say no to anything that might be a new opportunity for you.
Yeah.
Was really good advice. I mean, I don't suggest that people live their lives the way I have. There's been a price to pay. But, I've loved it. And I think that's, I was reading something somewhere and somebody said, the worst word in the English language is regret. And I had to agree. And I thought, yeah, I really don't regret stuff. It's like, I don't have a sense of how old I am. And I think, which is almost 80. And the reason I think is because I keep having things I need to do. I haven't finished. And I think that was really good. Another friend of mine, however, that was like a brother to me, called me one day and he said, "I think I've figured out the secret of life." And I said, "Oh, what is it, Miles?" And he said, "Keep moving. It may be forward." And I thought, yeah, I kind of had that one also.
Those are both really, really good. All right. Last bit here, Milton. For anyone who wants to learn more or maybe even possibly sign up for a class or read your book or follow your podcast, where should people go to connect with Milton Justice?
Okay, well, the podcast, and apparently I have a website, this is all way beyond me, is called idon'tneedanactingclass.com. No, it's at the end of the podcast called "I Don't Need an Acting Class," it says, for more information or anything, write questionsformilton@gmail.com. And Walker periodically called me and said, "There's a guy you should really meet." And I said, "Oh, Walker, I don't know." And he said, no, he's from Milan and he's in New York and he's been listening to the podcast and he really wants to meet you. And so Walker said, forces me to meet these people who I've now cast in a play. And so the same thing. Here's an interesting question. Somebody wrote, he said, "I think you should answer." And I realize I will never write another book. My admiration for writers is beyond. because it took me almost 20 years to write my book. But I have enough material for another book just because I keep answering questions.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Great. I'm
I
going to
think
put
that's
links.
how to find me.
Yeah. And everybody, I will put direct links in the show notes to the podcast and the website and the book and all that good stuff. And yeah, and if you're in New York, Milton mentioned live classes in September. Will those be on your website too?
Yes. We're in the midst of doing this. There's one other teacher in New York that I will ever recommend, and he just left Stella Adler School. His name is Patrick Quagliano, and he and I have always talked about opening a school. And so he left Stella School in New York, and he said, so why don't we start giving classes in the fall? So we're in the midst of organizing it. At the moment, it's called Actor Lab, actorlab.nyc. So we'll see how that title goes. But yeah, we're going live again. I'm going to get out of the house.
Wonderful. Milton, what a joy and an honor to talk to you. And thank you so much for all of this. And everyone out there, go check out his podcast and his book and anything else coming up. Milton, thank you so much.
Thank you. I had no idea I could talk at this hour.
You've been listening to the Page and Stage podcast. All my thanks to this week's guest and to all of you out there for listening. You can learn more about all my guests and access their websites and projects in the show notes. If you enjoyed or found value in this podcast, I'd like to ask a quick favor. Leaving a short review or comment helps me out a ton. It tells the algorithmic overlords that people are listening, and it helps other folks discover the show. So if you can post a review over at Apple Podcasts, and I've left a link and easy instructions in the show notes, or leave a comment on this episode on Substack or YouTube, wherever you happen to be listening or watching, I would be incredibly grateful. Plus, I do my absolute best to respond to every comment. Let's get into a fun conversation. I use an incredible online app, Riverside.fm, to produce this podcast. If you are interested in creating your own podcast or other audio or video content, I cannot recommend them highly enough. I left a link in the show notes so you can check them out for yourself. Both of my podcasts live over at pageandstage.art. And if you visit, you can even sign up for free to receive every future episode right into your inbox, as well as my weekly newsletter full of tips, tricks, inspiration, and encouragement for storytellers of all stripes. Again, that's pageandstage.art. Thank you again for listening. And until next time, I'm Jason Cannon, and I cannot wait to hear your story.